The budget today came at a very crucial juncture for our country. During this year, there are several state elections, and next year, the parliament elections are due along with some other states. In a political democracy in a poor country, obviously, for the government in power, there will be temptation to somehow please the voters and go for short-term advantages. We have to examine the budget from 3 points of view. First of all, we are a poor country, and therefore, unless the budget provides a measure of inclusion for everybody, all segments of population, the poor, the depressed, the rural, the uneducated, the low-skilled, the unorganized sectors, that budget will not be able to carry the rest of the country forward. The second thing we have to examine in a budget is it growth-oriented? Because without growth, we can never come out of poverty. Without growth, there cannot be industrialization or entrepreneurship or employment generation, and therefore no rise in incomes for the poor. And the third is it sustainable? Are we borrowing too much and putting the burden on the next generation? Let us see on all these 3 counts how this budget fares. The first is inclusion. It's quite impressive that special efforts are made by the finance minister to ensure that the unorganized sector, the artisans, the farm sector, they are given emphasis. For instance, modernization of farming, going for high-value crops in agriculture, and cooperatives, support to cooperatives in a variety of ways, so that collectively the small farmers can organize themselves and enhance both the productivity and the incomes. Then the focus on artisans and a whole lot of other steps, including tourism, service sector, etc. Already in the past few years, significant steps have been taken in digitization, transfer of monies through electronic mechanisms, the inclusive democracy in the form of Jan Dhan and direct benefits transfer, etc. This budget has further buttressed those opportunities, and therefore it is truly inclusive. I think we should give full marks to the finance minister for an inclusive budget, taking care of the ordinary, the poor, the unorganized, the rural, and the farm sector, and the artisan sector. The second thing is it growth-oriented? Last year, the government of India has come up with 7.5 lakh crores, 7.5 trillion rupees of expenditure on capital account. That means investments for the future, infrastructure and investments for the future to enhance industrialization and income generation for the people and job growth. Nobody expected a substantial rise this year. There is a 33% rise announced this year. It's now increased to 10 lakh crores. If you include the other capital account expenditure proposed, about 2.4 lakh crores for the railway account, capital account, and 1.3 lakh crores transferred to states so that the states can spend on capital account for the infrastructure and investment. It comes to 13.7 lakh crores. In just about 3 years' time, our capital expenditure on investment and infrastructure increased 3 times. 3 times in 3 years. It now stands at 4.5% of GDP. And this, on an economic growth which is reasonably good, while it's not as high as it should be for a country like India, we are still the highest among large economies in the world. This year, the finance minister said that our growth is estimated to be 7% in the current year. Next year, they expected a nominal growth of only 10.5%. That means the estimates given are conservative. They did not overestimate the tax receipts. They did not underestimate the expenditure. So these are realistic budgets, practical budgets, reliable budgets. And 13.7 lakh crores on capital account, and a variety of inducements and incentives for entrepreneurship, from agriculture to tourism to industrialization and electronics and energy transition, going for batteries and electric vehicles and so on and so forth, and storage batteries, and diamond industry and other employment generating industries. All this will give a significant boost to economic growth. And we should be genuinely happy with the finance minister for taking the responsible step, the disciplined step of conserving money for the legitimate expenditure for the future rather than squandering money today for temporary gains at the cost of the long-term growth. As a result, the fiscal deficit is coming down considerably. That's the third point. Is it sustainable? Are we doing in a manner that their future is secure? Our children are not overburdened. The fiscal deficit 3 years ago was just about 4.5%. It went up to 9.5% of the GDP in the wake of COVID. Last year, significant efforts were made to bring it down to 6.4%. And the finance minister met the target. The final revised figures indicate 6.4% is the fiscal deficit. That means we are borrowing that much of money. That is expenditure more than the income. For the next year, the finance minister proposed and estimated about 5.9% GDP, further reducing the borrowings. And she promised, and it's a credible promise because the last 2 years she has done a very good job, that in 3 years' time it will come down to 4.5% GDP, a sustainable one. And therefore it's a very sustainable budget. And most of the expenditure is now on capital account. The revenue deficit, that means the money you are borrowing in order to meet the current expenditure, effectively has come to only about 1.4% of GDP. In gross terms, it's 2.7%, but some of the expenditure is not revenue expenditure. Therefore, it's 1.4% of GDP. It's realistic to assume that within 3 years, we probably will bring down revenue deficit to close to zero. We are on path to fiscal consolidation, as we call it. Therefore, on the third count, also, Finance Minister did very well. Now the ball is in the courts of the states and the entrepreneurs. The states must respond. The states must give fillip to infrastructure, growth, employment generation, rather than yielding to temptation to give short-term shocks to the people. We have to provide welfare to the people in distress. But if that's all the governments do at the cost of growth, that means we are burdening the future generation for current expenditure. And we are not ensuring growth, and therefore poverty is perpetuated. Whatever the government of India is doing, the states must take a leaf out of that book and ensure that the future growth is good. In all this, for the income taxpayers, there's some very good news. There are significant reliefs for the salaried classes. Up to 7 lakh rupees now in the new tax regime, there's no tax. Now let's understand what it means. Even today, our per capita income is under 2 lakh rupees. That means about 3.5 times of the per capita income, the people do not have to pay any income tax. There is almost no country on earth where, at least the significant countries and major countries on earth where, at 3.5 times the per capita income, there is no income tax burden on the individuals. That's great news. Tens of millions, crores of income tax payers will be very happy with this news. At the same time, India has the highest tax rate effectively for the very wealthy people. The wealthy people can afford to pay, but the problem with very high taxation is they will not be encouraged to produce more wealth. Either they will be fudging of accounts or they will invest in other countries where the taxation is less. And therefore, a small concession is made. The highest tax slab, on top of the income tax, so far we had 37% additional surcharge on income tax. They reduced it to a more manageable 25%. In the coming years, it should come down further. We must be on par with the rest of the world so that the tax rates do not go up beyond 30 or 33%. The effective rate of tax from about 43% now for this group of people has come down to 39%. But over time, we must bring it down to about 30 or 33%. Because unless people feel that what they earned, they pay a fair tax, and the rest of it they can invest in the future, economic growth will come to a standstill. All in all, the finance minister deserves high praise for giving us an excellent budget in difficult circumstances. She disregarded the populist impulses in order to pander with the voters in the short term. She focused on the long-term growth and all the 3 indicators that we require to examine it by, namely inclusiveness, the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized, the rural, the unorganized sector, how to bring them into the economic mainstream. 2, economic growth and therefore creation of jobs and incomes. And 3, responsibility so that the future is not burdened. by the current expenditure. On all three grounds, she deserves high marks. And the budget is not even fudged. Amazingly, they gave us realistic numbers. They did not overestimate the revenues and therefore show somehow the deficits are reduced. They're actually underestimating revenues, in my opinion. For instance, for the next year, the nominal growth she estimated at 10.5%. That means if you assume about 4 or 5% inflation, she's only assuming about 5.5 or 6% of the economic growth. That means with modest projections, she's showing the revenues, not high projections and high revenues. All in all, very good budget. Now it's for us, the states and the entrepreneurs and all of us as people to utilize this opportunity, create growth, make our lives better for our children, create jobs, enhance incomes. If we sustain this path for the next 25 years, we can raise our incomes by at least 8 times. 25 years, 8 times. That should be our mantra. That is when India can say that we have arrived on the global scene.